The blizzard didn't just destroy my home, it erased everything I had built over 40 years. With nowhere left to go, I drove through the storm to my son's house, believing family was my last refuge. But he said, "You're just a burden," and slammed the door in my face. In that moment, I knew my own son had erased me from his life. But what he didn't know was that on the next stormy night, I met someone who would completely change my life and make him pay a lesson he would never forget. Hello everyone, welcome. Before we continue, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. If you were left outside in the freezing cold by someone you trusted most, what would you do? Share below. Note: this is a fictional story with dramatized details created to deliver meaningful, valuable insights. The sound wasn't a whistle or a howl. It was the scream of 1,000 rusted nails being ripped from ancient oak all at once. I stood in my kitchen, clutching a chipped mug of lukewarm tea, watching the ceiling plaster flex downward like a giant lung gasping for its final breath. For 38 years, this house on Monroe Street had been my sanctuary, a place where the only storms I faced were found within the pages of the epic tragedies I archived. But tonight, the tragedy had stepped off the shelf and into my reality. I am Nick Armstrong, a 68-year-old retired public librarian, with eyes that had spent decades tracing fine print in the Detroit public library system. And in this moment, I was witnessing the literal shredding of my history. The light fixture above the island flickered, once hummed with a dying electrical whine, and then exploded in a rain of glass. The wind began to peel the shingles back like skin, exposing the raw, splintering wood beneath. The weather alerts on my radio had called this a historic blizzard, a once-in-a-generation event moving into Detroit from the plains. But I had stayed. I had ignored the mandatory evacuation order issued 6 hours ago, because I couldn't bear to leave the library my wife Beatrice and I had spent our lives building. Every volume was a brick in the wall of our shared soul, and I chose to stand guard over them. A sentimental fool, thinking that my presence could somehow anchor the foundations against 90-mile-per-hour winds. Then the sky moved inside. The first structural failure was a deafening crack that vibrated through the soles of my slippers. It was the main ridge beam giving way. I dropped my mug, the porcelain shattering against the tile, and realized that my sentimentality had become a death sentence. "Not tonight, Beatrice," I whispered into the roaring dark. "Please, not the house." But the house wasn't listening. It was groaning in protest, the walls swaying with a terrifying rhythmic instability that told me the second floor was already lost. I had to move. I scrambled toward the basement door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The vacuum pressure created by the lost roof was so intense, it began to pull the smaller kitchen chairs toward the ceiling. I barely made it to the landing of the stairs before a sound like a freight train leveled the upper half of my world. I tumbled down the wooden steps, the darkness swallowing me as the power lines outside snapped with a sequence of blue flashes. I landed hard on the cold concrete floor near the old water heater that Beatrice always complained was too loud. Now I would have given anything for its mundane mechanical rumble. Instead, there was only the screeching of metal and the rhythmic thumping of debris hitting the floorboards above my head. I crawled into the corner, huddling beneath the sturdy oak workbench I'd used to repair bookbindings for 40 years at the library. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the one thing I had managed to grab, a single silver-framed photograph of my wife from our wedding day. I clutched it to my chest, the cold glass pressing against my skin. "I have you, Bea." I breathed, my eyes squeezed shut as the house continued to disintegrate. "I still have you. It's just wood. It's just wood." The basement felt like a coffin lined with copper pipes and regret. I stayed there for hours, suspended in a state of shock that numbed the growing chill. I listened to 40 years of memories being ground into gray pulp by the forces of nature. The sound of destruction is unique. It is the sound of endings of things that can never be put back together. Sometime before dawn, the roaring stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, snowy silence that pressed against my eardrums. I waited, shivering violently now, until the first gray light of Christmas morning filtered through the small basement windows. I stood up, my joints cracking with the effort, and climbed the stairs, one slow step at a time. I reached the top and pushed against the door. It didn't lead to my hallway. It led to the open sky. The entire second floor was gone, scattered across 3 city blocks like broken toys. The library, my little study, the bedroom where Beatrice had drawn her last breath, vanished. My collection of 4,000 rare books had been transformed into a gray slush covering the neighborhood, the ink of centuries of wisdom bleeding into the Detroit snow. You never realize how little you actually own until the wind decides to audit your life. I stood in my pajamas and my heavy winter coat, surrounded by splintered timber and the grit of drywall dust that coated my throat like ash. I reached into the pocket of my coat and found my wallet. I opened it with numb fingers. $42. That was the price of my life. I had no home, no books, and only enough cash for a few meals. That was when the memory of my son's voice hit me sharp and jagged as the debris at my feet. I had called Sterling an hour before the storm hit, desperate for a reason to leave, for a hand to reach out. His response had been a cold, detached dismissal. "If the house goes, Dad, don't expect me to bail you out of your hoarding," he had said. I looked at the ruins of Monroe Street, and then toward the gleaming glass towers of downtown Detroit, where Sterling lived in his luxury high-rise. I turned the key in the ignition of my old Ford truck, which had miraculously survived beneath a lean-to, praying the engine would turn over. Sterling's warning was no longer a threat. It was my only hope. The old Ford's engine groaned, a mechanical protest against the frozen Detroit air, but then it hummed to life. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I shifted into gear, the tires crunching through the icy debris of what used to be my porch. I watched the city's holiday lights blur through my cracked windshield, each twinkling bulb feeling like a mocking reminder of the warmth I no longer possessed. Every street lamp I passed seemed to spotlight a different piece of my ruin. A neighbor's fence flattened a tree, snapped like a toothpick, and the general gray despair of a city under siege by ice. The struggle of driving through the snow-clogged streets toward the glass towers of downtown Detroit was a slow, agonizing crawl. My wipers struggled against the freezing rain that had begun to fall, leaving streaks of crystalline frost that made the world look like a jagged watercolor painting. I clung to the steering wheel with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, not just from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that Sterling's warning was the only tether I had left to the world of the living. I was a 68-year-old man in his pajamas, covered in the dust of a dead house, driving toward a son who had already told me not to come. Is it possible for a heart to freeze faster than the water in a Detroit gutter? I wondered this as I pulled into the underground parking garage of Sterling's high-rise. The polished concrete and rows of luxury German SUVs made my battered Ford look like a scavenger, a piece of urban blight that had somehow breached the walls of a glass citadel. I caught my reflection in the elevator's polished steel doors as I ascended to the 23rd floor. I was a ghost, a hollow-eyed man with soot-streaked hair and the grime of 40 years of books under my fingernails. I didn't look like a resident's father. I looked like a liability. When the doors opened, the silence of the hallway was thick and expensive. I stood before Sterling Armstrong, a 40-year-old law partner, wearing a tailored silk blend suit that radiated a sterile wealth, and he looked at me with a detached, clinical annoyance that cut deeper than the wind outside. He stood there framed by the warm, amber light of his foyer, radiating an air of privilege and sterile comfort, while I stood in the drafty hall, smelling of wet rot and failure. "Sterling," I rasped, my voice nearly failing me. "The roof, the whole second floor is in the street. I have nowhere else." I watched his eyes dart from my grime-streaked face to the pristine white marble of his entryway. Then, Larissa Armstrong, 38, stood behind her husband, with the poised chill of a luxury travel consultant who only dealt in first-class destinations. She didn't offer a hand or a word of comfort. She simply placed a manicured hand on Sterling's shoulder, a silent anchor holding him in place. "Sterling, we have guests in the morning," she whispered, though I heard every word. It's a lot of drama for one night. His expensive cashmere felt like armor against the world, while my own coat felt like a heavy shroud. I saw the internal struggle in Sterling's eyes for a fleeting second, perhaps a memory of the father who taught him to ride a bike on Monroe Street, but the light died out quickly. He looked at his wife, then back at me, his expression settling into a mask of professional distance. "Dad, look." He started, his voice firm and devoid of the warmth he'd once possessed. "You're just going to be an obligation, Dad. Frankly, we want our privacy. You should have listened to me on the phone. You'll figure something out. You always do." While he hesitated to finish the sentence, Larissa reached into her designer purse. She didn't pull out a key or an invitation. She generously offered me a $20 bill. "This is for gas to get to a shelter," she said, her voice like a thin sheet of ice. I already looked a few up on my phone. Most of them take seniors first. The efficiency of her rejection was breathtaking. She had already decided my fate before I had even finished explaining that my bedroom no longer existed. Sterling took the bill from her and pressed it into my palm. His skin was warm, mine was like marble. "It's for the best, Dad. We really can't have the disruption right now." He began to step back, retreating into the sanctuary of his perfect curated life. "Sterling, please." I whispered the $20 bill, feeling like a hot coal in my hand. "It's 20 degrees outside. The city is shut down." The response was the soft, final click of the heavy oak door. You learn the true weight of silence when it's the only thing your son leaves you with. I stood there staring at the brass numbers on the wood, waiting for the latch to click back open. I waited for him to realize he was leaving his father to die in a truck. But the hallway remained silent, save for the muffled sound of a jazz record playing behind the door and the distant chime of a wine glass. Then the sound I will never forget, the heavy deadbolt sliding home. It was a sharp, metallic thud that echoed through the carpeted hallway, a sound I remembered from 3 years ago at Beatrice's funeral when Sterling had held my hand and promised, "This door is always open for you, Dad." Apparently that promise had an expiration date, and it had passed the moment I stopped being an asset and became a debt. I turned back toward the elevator, the $20 bill Larissa had pressed into my hand, feeling like a brand. I wasn't just homeless. I was orphaned by my own son in the middle of a Detroit winter. I stood in the carpeted silence of the hallway, realizing that the man I raised was gone, replaced by a stranger in a clinical coldness who valued his privacy more than my life. The heater in my Ford gasped its last breath of lukewarm air just as I shifted into park at the far edge of the Meyer lot under a buzzing security light that flickered like a dying star. I sat there in the sudden absolute silence of the cab, my breath already beginning to plume in front of me in thick, ghostly clouds. Behind me lay the glass towers of downtown Detroit, and the son who had just performed a clinical extraction of his father from his life. Ahead of me was nothing but an expanse of frozen asphalt and the hum of industrial refrigeration units from the store's loading docks. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled remains of my dignity, the $42 from my ruins, and the crisp 20 Larissa had practically thrown at me. $62. That is the value of a librarian's life today, I whispered to the cold glass of the windshield. I watched a few late-night shoppers exit the store, pushing cartloads of holiday leftovers and discounted wrapping paper. Their laughter reached me as a muffled rhythmic sound, a reminder that the world was still turning for everyone else. I was now on the outside, a spectator to the mundane beauty of a life that included a roof and a thermostat. I debated going inside, perhaps just to stand in the heat of the entryway, but the shame kept my hand off the door latch. "I just need to make it until morning," I told myself, clutching the steering wheel. The Ford was no longer a vehicle. It was a steel lung breathing in the Michigan winter and exhaling only the frost of my own breath. I turned off the engine to save what little gas remained, and the temperature inside the cab dropped with terrifying speed. It was as if the metal walls of the truck were actively sucking the warmth from my skin. I reached behind the seat, scrounging for anything to use as insulation, and found a stack of old newspapers and the emergency blanket Beatrice had tucked into the glove box years ago. I began to tape the newspapers against the side windows with a roll of masking tape, a pathetic attempt to slow the inevitable encroachment of the frost. When I finally unwrapped the emergency blanket, my heart sank. It was a practice version, a thin sheet of cheap plastic intended for a demonstration kit rather than actual survival. The crinkling sound it made as I wrapped it around my shoulders sounded like mocking applause in the silent truck. My teeth began to chatter, a violent, involuntary rhythm that made my jaw ache. Beatrice helped me stay awake. I pleaded, my eyes fixed on the flickering security light. I can't close my eyes. It's just the cold, Nick. It's just air. But the air felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against my chest. My bones didn't just ache. They felt like they were turning into brittle glass, ready to shatter at the next gust of wind. The wind outside began to rock the truck, the suspension groaning in a low, metallic moan. I tried to insulate my thoughts by reciting poems I had committed to memory over decades in the stacks. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, I started, but my mind was sluggish. The words felt like they were being dragged through thick molasses. I looked at the dashboard clock, certain that hours had passed, but only 20 minutes had ticked by since I last checked. The realization that I was still hours away from the dawn hit me like a physical blow. I was 68 years old, and I was losing the ability to feel my toes, and that wasn't a choice anymore. It was an invasion. Every time I drifted, I would jerk awake, my heart racing with a sudden spike of cortisol, but the intervals of consciousness were getting shorter. I found myself talking to Beatrice again, apologizing for the library, for the house, and for the son we had raised together. I'm so tired, Bae. So tired. I found myself wondering if she was waiting for me in a place that was perpetually 72 degrees. As I drifted toward a dangerous, heavy sleep, a flash of blue and red caught the corner of my eye. I looked into the side mirror and saw a police cruiser slowly prowling the rows of the lot. For a fleeting second, I felt a surge of hope. Surely they would see a man in distress and offer a warm station house. But that hope was instantly replaced by a paralyzing fear. If they saw me, they wouldn't see a retired librarian. They would see a transient loitering in a private lot. They would tow my only remaining shelter, leaving me to die on the bare pavement, without even a thin sheet of plastic to cover me. I slid down in the seat, pulling the crinkling blanket over my head, holding my breath to keep the windows from fogging further. I watched the blue and red lights reflect off the ice on my side mirror. They slowed, once, then moved on, likely assuming I was just sleeping it off. It was a chilling thought, knowing that Sterling had used the house on Monroe Street as collateral, burying the trap in documents I had signed, believing they were routine refinancing papers. It was a profound, stinging humiliation to be a man of letters hiding from the very protectors I had paid taxes to support for 40 years. As the cruiser eventually moved on, the tension left my body, and with it went the last of my energy. I realized the cold wasn't hurting anymore. The biting stings had faded into a dull, comfortable numbness that felt almost like a warm bath. That was the most terrifying thing of all, a biological lie telling me that the end was peaceful. My eyes finally slid shut, the silhouette of the Meyer sign fading into a gray abyss. In that moment, I wasn't Nick Armstrong anymore, just a cold object in a frozen truck, waiting for the sun to decide if I was worth waking up. The sun wasn't a bringer of warmth. It was a cold, white eye peering through the frost of my windshield, judging me for still being alive. I woke up not to the sound of an alarm, but to the agonizing pain of circulation returning to my limbs. It felt like 1,000 needles were being driven into my skin, a slow, burning thaw that made me gasp for air. I looked out the side mirror and realized the police cruiser from the night before had moved on, leaving me in a kingdom of gray ice. My old Ford was now encased in a thin, translucent layer of frozen rain, turning my sanctuary into a glass-walled tomb. I tried to move my fingers, and they clicked like dry twigs. I had to make myself presentable. Librarians don't look like victims, I told myself, my voice sounding like sandpaper. I used a small bottle of half-frozen water to dampen my wild hair, trying to smooth down the strands that had matted against my head during the night. I scrubbed the soot from my cheeks, using the hem of my undershirt, terrified that looking homeless would lead to my immediate removal from the lot. I had to walk straight. I had to keep my eyes up. I opened the door, the ice cracking with a sound like a gunshot, and stepped onto the frozen asphalt. Every joint in my body protested, but I forced a steady gait toward the store. I entered the nearby Walmart to use the restroom and buy supplies, the sudden blast of heated air from the entryway, making my skin itch with a violent intensity. In the bright, sterile, fluorescent light of the restroom, I finally saw my reflection in a full-length mirror. My skin was a waxy, sickly gray, and my movements were stiff and elderly. I looked like a man who had been excavated from a glacier. How many layers of polyester does it take to hide the scent of a man who hasn't showered in the ruins of his own life? I wondered this as I shuffled toward the aisles. I spent a significant portion of my remaining $62 on basic sustenance, bread, peanut butter, and a large insulated thermos. I felt every shopper's gaze like a physical weight on my back, convinced they could see the debris of Monroe Street still clinging to my soul. I stood at the register, my hands trembling as I counted out the bills. "That'll be $18.40, sir," the teenage cashier said, her voice devoid of interest. I have it right here." One moment I stammered, fumbling with the crumpled currency. The receipt was a lie. It said I bought bread, but I was actually buying time. I was buying another 24 hours of existence. I walked over to the self-service coffee station, my heart hammering with the simple hope of filling my new thermos with something hot. I had just reached for the carafe when a young floor manager in a blue vest stepped into my path. "Sir, we need the tables for paying customers," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I am a customer," I replied, holding up my crumpled receipt with a hand that I couldn't keep still. "I have the receipt right here." He didn't even look at the paper. He looked at my shoes, which were stained with drywall dust, and my coat, which was missing 2 buttons. "Move along, please," he added, his eyes scanning the store for a security guard. "We don't want any trouble." Their pity was a sharp blade, but their indifference was the slow poison that was actually killing me. I exited the store into the biting wind, realizing that the $62 wasn't just money. It was my last ticket to being treated like a human being, and that ticket was being punched by everyone I met. I trudged back to the truck, the cold Detroit air reclaiming me the moment I stepped off the sidewalk. I climbed into the cab and turned the key, expecting the familiar rumble of the engine. There was only a hollow, clicking silence. I looked at the dashboard, and my heart sank. In my hypothermic state the night before, I had accidentally left the dome light on. The battery was completely dead. My truck was no longer a vehicle. It was a permanent tomb. I sat there staring through the frost, feeling my identity slipping away with every breath. I reached for a discarded newspaper in the footwell, hoping to find something to insulate the floorboards. Instead, my eyes caught a small blurb in the society section. There was a photo of Sterling and Larissa glowing with health and expensive dental work. They were at a high-end charity gala for the Detroit Homeless Initiative. The caption noted they had attended on Christmas night, the very night they had locked their deadbolt against me. I stared at the glossy photo of my son smiling for the cameras, his arm around a woman who had handed me a $20 bill as if she were tipping a valet. For the first time since the roof came off my house, I didn't feel cold. I felt a spark of something much hotter and far more dangerous. My own son was being hailed as a protector of the invisible, while he let his own father become a ghost. I gripped the steering wheel, the plastic cold against my palms, but the rage was beginning to boil in my chest. He was talking about dignity to a room full of people in tuxedos while I was washing my face in a public sink. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a pressure behind my eyes that finally pushed back against the exhaustion. I stared at the photo until the ink seemed to blur, and I realized that I wasn't going to die quietly in this parking lot. I wasn't just a librarian anymore, I had become a witness. I was a record of everything they wanted to pretend didn't exist. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees by sunset, and the rage that had sustained me in the Walmart aisles began to freeze along with my marrow. Rage is a fickle fuel. It burns hot and bright until the Michigan winter smothers it in a blanket of white, leaving nothing but the ash of a man behind. I sat in the darkness of the cab, clutching the newspaper photo of Sterling until the ink smudged against my frozen thumb. I realized then that the spark of fury I'd felt earlier wasn't a sign of recovery. It was the first symptom of my brain beginning to misfire, a cruel biological trick played by a mind starving for heat. The third night in the Meijer parking lot felt personal, as if the wind had learned my name and was whispering it through the door seals. I experienced the terrifying transition from violent tooth-rattling shivering to a strange, numb stillness. I recognized this from the medical texts I had once cataloged at Wayne State. It was the biological white flag. The body, having exhausted its reserves, simply stops fighting. The shivering stopped. "That's the end of the line, isn't it?" I asked the dashboard. "Stay awake, Nick. If you sleep, you're a ghost." But the command carried no weight. Silence is the loudest sound a dying man ever hears, and it was filling the truck like rising water. I leaned my head against the frozen glass, my eyes drifting shut despite the screams of my fading survival instinct. The world didn't go black. It went silver. The interior of the truck began to shimmer and stretch the dashboard, transforming into the polished oak of my old library stacks. The smell of damp wool and old parchment filled the air so thick I could almost taste the dust of 1,000 archived stories. I wasn't alone. Beatrice, my wife of 40 years, sat in the passenger seat with the same gentle smile she'd worn on our wedding day, though she had been in the ground for 3 winters. She looked warm, lit by a soft amber light that shouldn't exist in a frozen Ford. "Nick, you've worked long enough," she said, her voice a melody I hadn't heard in 1,000 days. "Come home." I tried to reach for her, but my arm felt like it was made of lead. I lost the books." I whispered, my heart fluttering like a trapped moth. "I lost everything. I couldn't protect the house." She reached out her hand, hovering near mine without touching. "Books can be replaced, my love. You can't." The seductive peace of the hallucination was more dangerous than the wind. I felt a paradoxical heat blooming in my chest, the burning sensation of late-stage hypothermia that makes the dying believe they are roasting. If a man dies in a Meijer parking lot and no one is there to check his pulse, did his life ever really happen? The thought flickered through my mind like a dying candle. I began to fumble with the buttons of my heavy coat, my numb fingers working with a fatal instinctual urgency to shed the very layers keeping me alive. The world was fading into a soft, welcoming gray. One more minute, I told myself, the paradox of the heat making me feel as though I were lying in a summer meadow. Just a short nap. The frost on the windshield was a lace curtain drawn between me and the world of the living, and I was ready to step through it. I saw a warm light approaching from the distance, a golden glow that I assumed was Beatrice coming to lead me away. It was so bright it pierced through the silver fog of my failing vision. I was ready to let go, ready to stop being a liability to a son who didn't want me and a city that didn't see me. I closed my eyes for what I thought was the last time the sound of my own heartbeat slowing to a rhythmic, heavy thud that matched the ticking of the cooling engine. Then a sound broke through the silence. It wasn't Beatrice's voice. It was a sharp, metallic rapping on the window glass, a rhythmic pounding that sounded like a judge's gavel coming down on a final sentence. I tried to groan, but my throat was a desert of ice. The dark silhouette of a woman in a heavy winter coat loomed over me, her shape blocking out the flickering security lights of the parking lot. She held a high-intensity LED flashlight that cut through the frost like a surgical laser, turning the white ice into a blinding, crystalline cage. I couldn't tell if she was an angel or the Reaper come to collect the remains of a man who had already surrendered. The glass vibrated under her fist, the sound echoing through my skull. Sir, can you hear me?" Her voice muffled by the storm, but sharp with a detached authority. I stared at her, my pupils blown wide, unable to process the reality of a human face after 3 days of ghosts. The warm light I had seen wasn't the afterlife. It was a very real, very bright beam of salvation peering through my frozen window. She didn't look away. She didn't look through me like the manager at the store. She looked at me as if I were the only thing in the world that mattered. The rapping on the glass increased in urgency, the sound splintering the last of my silver hallucination. I felt a surge of terror, the last spark of life before the dark. I watched her hand reach for the door handle, her silhouette a dark blot against the swirling white of the frozen onslaught. As I slipped into the first heavy folds of a lethal hypothermic coma, my last conscious thought wasn't about the son who abandoned me or the house that fell. It was a question whispered into the void of the cab. Is it time to go, Beatrice, or is the story finally starting over? The cold water hit my face like a slap, but it wasn't water. It was the sensation of a window being forced open and a voice calling a name I hadn't used in years. The window shattered, not from the wind, but from a calculated blow that sent diamonds of glass dancing across my lap and let in a scream of cold that finally broke my hallucination. I felt a pair of gloved hands reaching through the jagged frame, searching for the lock with a desperate efficiency. The door groaned open, and the dark silhouette I had seen through the frost lunged into the cab. I was too weak to protest, my muscles as stiff as the frozen newspaper on the floorboards. I was roughly handled as the woman cleared the glass shards from my coat and unbuckled my seatbelt. She dragged me toward the passenger seat of her own idling SUV, which sat mere feet away, radiating a heat that felt like a blast furnace compared to the tomb of my Ford. Dr. Ilara Redmond, a 31-year-old pediatric cardiologist, whose sharp blue eyes missed nothing, tapped urgently on the frozen truck window just moments before pulling me into her world. She worked with a breathless authority, wrapping me in high-grade thermal blankets that crinkled with the promise of life. She checked my pulse with fingers that were steady despite the sub-zero wind howling through the open doors. "Don't you dare close your eyes, Nick," she commanded, her voice cutting through the fog in my brain. "Do you hear me? Stay with me." I tried to speak, but my tongue was a heavy, useless object. How do you know my name?" I finally managed to croak. She didn't answer. She simply shifted the vehicle into gear and accelerated out of the mire lot, the tires screaming against the ice. The heat didn't just warm me, it hurt. It was a searing pins and needles sensation that made me want to crawl out of my own skin. Yet I clung to the blankets as if they were the only solid things in a shifting universe. I realized then that she didn't just find me by chance. She had a medical bag already prepped for severe hypothermia sitting on the center console, open and ready. She had been checking the lot every night after seeing me turned away, waiting for a moment she could safely approach. We arrived at the Henry Ford Hospital emergency entrance, but instead of the usual chaos of the ambulance bay, she directed the car through a restricted side door. She identified herself to the security staff with a sharp nod, and they snapped into action without a word. I was placed on a gurney and whisked through back hallways, bypassing the crowded waiting rooms where people might ask questions I wasn't prepared to answer. "Nick Armstrong, The man who had spent 40 years cataloging the lives of others was now a shadow patient. "She's a family friend," I heard her tell a nurse as they hooked me up to a warmed IV drip. "John Doe for now. I've spoken to administration. We'll delay formal intake until he's stabilized." "Why are you hiding me?" I whispered the words catching in my dry throat. "Are you the law?" She looked down at me, her expression a mix of focused resolve and something far softer that I couldn't quite name. How can a stranger's hands feel like they were carved from the same stone as my own memories? The question looped in my mind as the monitors began their rhythmic, synthetic chirp. The hospital monitor beeped a steady rhythm, a metronome keeping time for a life I had already tried to surrender. Once I was stabilized in a private room, shielded from the standard social service reporting system, the woman returned. She wasn't carrying a plastic cup of hospital water. She held a porcelain mug of Earl Grey tea steeped with a specific sprig of dried lavender. The scent hit me before the steam did, a fragrant ghost that pulled at a thread of memory deep in the back of my mind. I watched her movements, the way she tilted her head to the left when she checked the flow rate of my IVA gesture that was devastatingly familiar. "You used to say lavender was the only thing that could quiet a loud mind," she said softly, placing the mug on the rolling tray. My heart, which had been a sluggish, cold organ, gave a violent thud against my ribs. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling with more than just the remnants of the chill. "Please, just tell me who you are." She reached out and took my hand, her grip identical to a 5-year-old girl's who used to be afraid of the dark during Detroit thunderstorms. As the warmth of the tea and the room began to truly reach my core, I noticed a small, faded scar on her wrist. It was a jagged L shape, a permanent mark from a childhood accident involving a heavy library book cart that only I and Beatrice had been there to witness. I whispered the name Annie, a name that had been a wound in my heart for 20 years. She didn't deny it. She didn't pull away. She just squeezed my hand and told me to sleep. I let my eyes close, the antiseptic smell of the hospital fading into the scent of lavender and old books. I was safe, not because of the brick and mortar of the hospital, but because of the woman who had spent a lifetime finding her way back to the man who once taught her how to read. The hospital lights were too bright for a man who had spent 3 days in the shadows, but Alara's presence was the only anchor I had left in a world that had tried to erase me. I drifted into a safe, warm sleep, knowing that when I woke up, the mystery of the doctor in the SUV would be the first chapter of a story I never expected to finish. The hospital gown felt like a paper shroud, but the clean shirt Alara brought me smelled of sunlight and expensive laundry detergent, the first scent of a world where I wasn't already dead. I sat on the edge of the bed, my legs dangling like heavy pendulums, watching the light filter through the sterile blinds. She moved around the room with a focused, surgical grace, signing discharge papers and speaking to the nurses in a low, authoritative hum. There was a quiet efficiency in her movements that sidestepped the hospital's standard social workers and the inevitable police report regarding my abandoned truck. I realized then that she was shielding me, treating me as a visiting relative rather than a homeless statistic. I watched her as she handed me a new coat. It was a tweed blazer, soft and thick, that fit my shoulders with an uncanny precision. I realized that this blazer wasn't new at all. It was a high-end replica of the specific tweed jacket I had lost when the roof of Monroe Street was torn away. I didn't say anything, but my heart gave a strange, uneven thump. She had been cataloging my life from a distance for years, long before the storm hit. She helped me into her car, a modern SUV that hummed with a quiet power. As I settled into the leather seat, she reached over and adjusted the climate control. The digital display blinked once and settled on exactly 72 degrees, my preferred setting for decades. I looked at her sharp profile as she pulled out of the parking garage. "You've been thinking about this for a long time, haven't you?" I asked, my voice finally finding some strength. She didn't look at me, but her grip on the steering wheel tightened just enough to notice. "I told them you were a family friend," she said, ignoring my question. "It's easier this way." We're going to get you some coffee. How many years of silence does it take to make a man's own voice sound like a stranger's to him? I wondered this as we drove through the familiar gray streets of Detroit. The city blurred past the window like a reel of film being played back too fast, skipping over the frames of my own history. She took me to Astro Coffee in Corktown, a place that felt like a bridge between the old industrial Detroit and the new gleaming one my son inhabited. We sat at a small wooden table near the back, the hiss and grind of the industrial espresso machine providing a rhythmic backdrop to our silence. Over the steam of my cup, she spoke about her career as a surgeon, but her words were laced with a pedagogical philosophy that I recognized as my own. Someone told me once that a public librarian isn't just a keeper of books, but a guide for lost souls, she said, watching me over the rim of her cup with eyes that were ancient and hopeful. Does that sound right to you? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. I used to say that to a little girl who spent every Saturday in my stacks. I replied, my hand trembling as I set my cup down. The coffee was bitter. The truth was going to be worse. Why are you doing this for me, Alara? Or whatever your name is today. I need to know why a stranger knows the temperature of my blood and the shape of my soul. She smiled sadly, a gesture that pulled at a memory so deep I couldn't quite grasp it. Because family isn't something you're born into, Nick, she said. It's something you survive for. Some stories need the right setting to be told. She didn't give me time to press further. She led me back to the car and began to drive toward a quiet, historic neighborhood, far from the cold glass skyscrapers where Sterling lived. As we turned onto a tree-lined street, I felt a strange magnetic pull toward a modest two-story home with a wraparound porch. My librarian's intuition, that internal compass that had helped me find thousands of lost volumes over 38 years at the Detroit Public Library System, was telling me that the mystery was about to reach its final chapter. She pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. I sat there, unable to move my gaze, locked on a small object in her front garden. It was a weathered wooden birdhouse with a crooked roof, the paint peeling, and the wood grayed by years of Michigan seasons. My breath hitched in my throat. I had built that birdhouse with a foster child 20 years ago in my workshop on Monroe Street. It was amateurish and flawed, yet she had kept it through every transition of her life. I looked at the crooked birdhouse, and then at her, my hand trembling, as I reached for the door handle. I knew that once I stepped inside that house, the Nick Armstrong who died in the cold of the Meyer parking lot would never come back. I felt as though I were stepping onto the first page of a book I had thought was finished years ago. Ilara stood by the front door, her keys jangling in the quiet afternoon. She didn't rush me. She stood there with a patient, heavy expectation, waiting for me to cross the threshold into a past I had buried under a mountain of library archives. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs one last time before I stepped into the warmth she had prepared for me. Task 3.2. Every scent of cedar and old paper hit me like a physical blow as I crossed the threshold, my boots treading softly on the dark hardwood floor. It was a time capsule, a sanctuary that felt more like my own home than the ruin I had left behind in the snow. I walked into the living room, my eyes wide and searching, and I stopped dead in my tracks. The furniture wasn't just similar to mine. It was arranged with a precision that mirrored my own deeply ingrained habits. The bookshelves faced the large bay windows to catch the indirect morning light, and a high-backed reading chair was angled perfectly toward the fireplace. I felt a sense of disorienting nostalgia, as if I were trespassing in a dream I had once forgotten how to dream. Ilara remained silent, hanging up her heavy winter coat with a slow, deliberate grace. She watched me with a patient, heavy expectation as I drifted like a ghost toward the mantelpiece. Everything in this room. It feels like a memory I haven't finished writing, I whispered, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the quiet space. I ran a hand over the smooth wood of a side table, half expecting my fingers to come away, covered in the ash of Monroe Street. Ilara stepped into the room, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of the lamps. Maybe you just forgot who the co-author was, Link, she replied softly. I looked at her, and for a moment the years of cold and betrayal seemed to melt away. Can a photograph be a Horcrux, holding a piece of a soul that the world tried its best to incinerate? I wondered this as my gaze locked onto a silver-framed photograph tucked between two thick medical journals on the mantel. My hand trembled so violently I had to use both to pick it up. The silver was cold and smooth, but the image inside burned like a sun. It was a picture of a younger me and Beatrice, kneeling in our old garden behind a gap-toothed blonde girl who was proudly holding up a sheet of paper. The memory of that Saturday crashed over me with the force of a tidal wave. It was the day of the long division breakthrough, followed by the celebratory blueberry pancakes. But as I looked closer, I realized something that made my heart stop. The math sheet the girl was holding in the photo wasn't just a prop. It was the actual original paper with my jagged red A+ and the little smiley face I used to draw for her. I thought that paper had been lost in the chaos of the 2005 move, when the state took her away. She had carried it through every foster home, every border crossing, and every lonely night in Canada. It was her most prized possession, a fragment of Armstrong praise that she had used to build her own foundation. Annie, my little Annie. I finally whispered the name, tasting like salt and old tears on my tongue. She stepped closer, her eyes shimmering with a reflected light. I told you I'd get an A in the mathematics of life, Dad, she said, her voice finally breaking. The glass of the frame was cold, but the image inside burned like a sun. She began to speak her words, pouring out like a river that had finally breached a dam. She confirmed she was the foster daughter taken from us, so abruptly moved to Canada by a system that didn't care for the roots she had planted in our library. She told me she had spent a year searching for me after moving back to Detroit, as Dr. Redmond, watching over me from a distance, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself. She had been the one watching the house, the one who had seen Sterling turn me away. I looked for you, Annie. I cried, the tears finally spilling over. I went to the courts. I tried everything. I know, she whispered, stepping into my personal space. I found the records you left behind. I found the letters you wrote to the agency. I've been waiting for the right moment to come home. We collapsed into a single desperate embrace, the kind that only happens when two people have been wandering in the wilderness for far too long. This was the true end of my homelessness. It didn't matter that the Monroe Street house was a pile of splinters. I was anchored here, in the arms of a girl who had grown into a woman, but still held on to me with the same fierce grip of a 5-year-old who was afraid of the dark. The 20 years between us didn't feel like a chasm anymore. They felt like a bridge we had finally finished building in the dark. As we held each other, the sound of a log crackling in the fireplace was the only noise in the world. But then Alara pulled back slightly. Her eyes, which had been warm and wet with tears, shifted. They turned to a cold, surgical steel that I recognized from her professional life at the hospital. She reached for a thick manila folder sitting on the coffee table, her grip firm and purposeful. Nick, she said, her voice losing its tremor. I didn't just find you by accident, and I didn't just buy the house next to your old lot for the view. I bought it months ago, because I knew what Sterling was doing. I saw the warmth in her eyes turn to a hard, defensive glint. I didn't just find you, she repeated. I've been salvaging what's left of your life from the ruins he created. I held her as if she were still 6 years old, but as she pulled back, the warmth in her eyes turned to a cold, surgical steel that I recognized from her work at the hospital. I felt a chill of a different kind, not the cold of the blizzard, but the icy realization that the battle for my life wasn't over. It was just changing fronts. The joy of our reunion lasted only as long as it took for Alara to reach for a thick manila folder on the coffee table. The joy of finding my daughter was like a warm hearth, but the papers she spread across the mahogany table were blocks of ice threatening to put out the fire for good. We moved to the kitchen, where the overhead lights were brighter, casting long, sharp shadows across the surface. She began to lay out the fragments of my life she had salvaged from the ruins of Monroe Street before the city crews could bulldoze the memories into the landfill. I watched her hands steady and surgical as she smoothed out water-damaged tax returns and library certificates that smelled of wet, mildewed paper and ozone. Then she pulled out a crisp, dry folder she had been holding back, placing it in the center of the table with a sound that felt unnecessarily loud in the quiet kitchen. I opened it to find a promissory note from 15 years ago, a document I had archived in the back of my mind under the label of fatherly duty. It represented the $53,000 Beatrice and I had scraped together from our retirement bedrock to fund Sterling's first independent law firm. I stared at the ink, which was smudging slightly under my damp fingers. I told myself he was just waiting for the right quarter to pay it back. I whispered my voice, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. He wasn't waiting for a quarter. Dad, Alara said, her voice dropping an octave. He was waiting for you to forget. As I leaned in to read the fine print, the room seemed to tilt. The note wasn't just a loan agreement. It was a trap. Sterling had used the house on Monroe Street as collateral buried in documents I had signed, believing they were routine refinancing papers. Burying the clause in a mountain of legalese I had trusted him to navigate, it meant that my son had fraudulently transferred the title to his name, turning the sanctuary I built into his personal equity while I still slept under its roof. Ink doesn't bleed. Only people do. My lungs felt tight, the air in the kitchen suddenly too thin to support the weight of this revelation. The taste of cold, forgotten coffee turned bitter in the back of my throat as I realized my son hadn't just turned me away from his door. He had been waiting for the storm to finish the job he started with a pen. Alara didn't stop there. She slid a tablet toward me, its blue light reflecting in my glasses like a digital predator. She had recovered an email chain from a synced cloud account on my old device, one I hadn't touched in months. The subject line read, "Dad Situation." I read the words Sterling had written to Larissa describing the frozen onslaught as a perfect opportunity to break my stubbornness through desperation. He spoke of my life as a logistical hurdle, a transition into a low-cost care facility that needed to be facilitated by my own loss of autonomy. He called my near death an opportunity, I asked, the words catching in my throat. He didn't just turn you away, Alara said, her eyes fixed on mine. He was counting on the cold to do his work for him. He wanted the lot cleared, Nick. He wanted the assets without the burden. How do you file a son's betrayal under family when it reads like a crime report? The question circled my mind as I scrolled further down the screen. I saw a message sent just hours after I had been turned away from his high-rise. Sterling had emailed a real estate agent asking for a valuation of the vacant lot on Monroe Street. He assumed I was already dead or incapacitated, discarded like the wet books in my gutter. The coldness of his strategy made the blizzard outside seem like a mild spring breeze. I fell into a profound silence, my mind cataloging these betrayals like misplaced books in a library that had been set on fire. I looked at my hands, still slightly gray from the frostbite, and then at the daughter who had spent her life trying to find her way back to a man my own blood had tried to erase. The despair I had felt in the Meyer parking lot, that heavy leaden surrender, began to crystallize into something else entirely. It was a hard, library-quiet determination. My heart was no longer a bruised organ. It was a stone being sharpened for a fight. I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to turn the page and hope for a better chapter. I was going to rewrite the ending. I have spent my life teaching children that stories have consequences, I said, my voice finally steadying. Alara nodded, her jaw set in a line of surgical precision. Then let's make sure Sterling finally learns the lesson, she replied. We sat there in the silence of the kitchen, two people bound not by the law, but by a shared history of survival. The plan didn't require a storm. It only required the truth and a very expensive table at the Whitney. I realized that Sterling's greatest mistake wasn't assuming I would die. It was assuming I would stay a victim if I lived. He forgot that a librarian knows where all the secrets are shelved. I closed the folder with a click that sounded like a coffin lid, looked up at Alara, and for the first time since the storm hit, my voice didn't shake. "We are going to audit his life," I said, "and he is going to find that the interest on his debt is more than he can ever afford to pay." I felt a strange sense of peace, the kind that comes when the path forward is finally clear, even if it leads directly into the heart of the storm. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a reckoning. The plan didn't require a storm. It only required the truth and a very expensive table at the Whitney. I sat in Alara's study, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves of medical journals that reminded me of my own lost library. The room smelled of old leather and precision, a fitting headquarters for the architect of a reckoning. We weren't just going to sue Sterling. We were going to audit his soul. Alara sat across from me, her eyes tracking the movements of my fountain pen as I listed the demands. We decided to forgo the lawyers for the initial strike. A man like Sterling doesn't fear the law as much as he fears a tarnished reputation. I insisted that the confrontation happen on neutral high-stakes ground, the Whitney Mansion on Woodward Avenue. It is a place of mahogany crystal and deep-seated Detroit vanity, a stage where Sterling's ego would prevent him from making the kind of scene that might spill into the public eye. I reached into the breast pocket of my borrowed blazer and pulled out a small, yellowed envelope. "I haven't just kept the promissory note, Alara," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I have the original letter Beatrice wrote to Sterling on his 10th birthday. It was a beautiful, handwritten piece about the weight of a promise and the sacred bond between those who share the same name. I intend to use it as my primary psychological weapon. If he wants to talk about assets and liabilities, I will show him the only debt he can never truly repay. If a son builds a palace on the rubble of his father's bones, does he ever really expect the ghosts to stay buried?" I spent the afternoon in the living room, reviewing the salvaged documents one last time. I looked for the human story behind the cold, legal jargon, tracing the slow erosion of the boy I once knew into the man who valued a vacant lot over a human life. I practiced my voice reciting the words until they were as sharp as a surgeon's blade. "I am not a burden," I whispered to my steady reflection in the darkened window. "I am the man who taught him to read. I am the librarian of his conscience." "Be watch over me," I breathed, clutching the silver-framed photo. "I'm doing this for both of us." My words were no longer fragile whispers. They were stones being placed in a sling. By the time the sun began to set, the transformation was complete. I was no longer the freezing man in the Meyer parking lot. I was a father coming to collect a debt of honor. The next morning, the detached phase of the plan began. Alara sat at her desk in the Henry Ford Hospital office, surrounded by the sterile scent of antiseptic and the low hum of life support monitors. She assumed her most professional clinical persona, the one that made her seem more like an institution than a woman. She reached Sterling's secretary at the firm, identifying herself with a terrifyingly calm authority as a pediatric cardiologist, calling regarding a critical family medical matter involving Nick Armstrong. I watched her unmoving reflection in the glass of her office door as she waited for him to pick up. When Sterling finally came on the line, his voice was a hollow, echoing sound over the speakerphone. "Mr. Armstrong, this is Dr. Redmond." Alara said, her voice a razor of professionalism. "We need to discuss your father's stabilization and future care immediately." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that spoke volumes of his discomfort. Is he going to be a problem?" Sterling asked, the irritation in his tone barely masked by a thin layer of concern. "I mean, is this urgent? We have a very heavy week at the firm." I felt a wave of disgust wash over me as I listened to him weigh my existence against his billable hours. He wasn't afraid of my death. He was afraid of the hassle of my survival. Lies are expensive. The bill was coming due. Sterling began to stammer, trying to explain why he couldn't come to the hospital immediately. But then he said something that made the air in the room turn to ice. "Look, doctor, I've already begun telling my colleagues and the board that my father passed away peacefully during the storm," he admitted, thinking he was speaking to a sympathetic medical professional. "If he suddenly stabilized, it's going to be extremely difficult for my professional credibility. I need to know exactly what the status is before I make a move." Ilara looked at me, her blue eyes turning to hard flint. I didn't move. I simply watched the vibrating hum of the smartphone on the mahogany desk. This was the final piece of evidence. He hadn't just abandoned me. He had already performed the social burial. My living presence was now a literal threat to the carefully curated image he had built on the lie of my demise. Ilara didn't blink. She suggested a private meeting at the Whitney to discuss the sensitive nature of the paperwork and the transition to a permanent care facility. Sterling agreed to the meeting at the Whitney, his voice dripping with the relief of a man who thought he was finally going to sign away his last responsibility, completely unaware that he was walking into his own sentencing. He thought he was coming to bury the last of the paperwork. He didn't know he was coming to meet the ghost he had created. The Whitney stood like a Gothic sentinel on Woodward Avenue, its stone walls holding more secrets than the law firm Sterling called home. I smoothed the lapel of my new wool coat, the fabric feeling like a suit of armor, as I stepped into the dim, amber glow of the Whitney's grand foyer. The air here was heavy with the scent of expensive prime rib and aged bourbon, a smell that spoke of old money and the kind of stability I had thought was my birthright until a week ago. I arrived early, as I always have, finding my way to a private wood-paneled corner that Ilara had specifically reserved. The staff moved with a practiced feline elegance, their footsteps silent on the thick carpets. It was a sharp, jarring contrast to the chaotic survival of the Meyer parking lot, where the only service I'd received was the biting wind. I took my seat, positioning myself, so I was partially obscured by a high-backed leather chair, a silent observer in a house of ghosts. A quiet table in the back, please, I had told the maître d'hôtel, somewhere with a view of the door. "I'm expecting my family. They are a bit late to the truth." I spent those waiting minutes practicing the breathing techniques I used to employ during difficult library board meetings. I needed my pulse steady. I needed to be the librarian again, the one who handles fragile, explosive truths with white gloves. I glanced toward a table near the center of the room and saw a man I recognized from the legal journals Ilara had shown me. It was the senior partner of Sterling's firm. Ilara had orchestrated his presence here tonight under the guise of a separate dinner, ensuring that any scene Sterling might attempt would be witnessed by the very man who held his career in his hands. Does a predator ever recognize the scent of the blood they spilled once the victim stops running? I wondered this as the heavy front doors opened and Sterling walked in, radiating the effortless, hollow confidence of the Detroit upper class. Sterling was accompanied by Larissa, both of them dressed in a way that signaled they were merely tolerating this medical update before moving on to something more important. Sterling looked around the room with an air of clinical boredom, his eyes skipping over the shadows where I sat. They were led to the table where Ilara was already waiting, her posture perfect, her expression a mask of professional detachment. "Dr. Redmond, I hope this won't take long," Sterling said as he pulled out a chair for Larissa. "We have a late reservation elsewhere, and this whole urgent matter has already disrupted my afternoon." I watched from the gloom, feeling a cold knot of disgust tighten in my stomach. "Please sit," Ilara replied, her voice a calm, dangerous hum. "The condition we are discussing tonight is far more permanent than a dinner reservation." The silver was polished. The lies were not. I watched Sterling reach for his water glass, his movements sharp and impatient. Larissa sat beside him, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for someone more interesting to talk to. They were so certain of their world, so convinced that the man who had raised them was a footnote they had already erased from the text of their lives. Ilara took a slow breath and removed her professional glasses, placing them on the white linen cloth. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. "Sterling." She began, her voice shifting from the detached tone of Dr. Redmond to something much older. "Do you remember the rabbit? The one with the torn ear you helped me fix with Scotch tape back in '94. Sterling froze the glass halfway to his lips. He squinted at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Who are you?" "You look like a ghost of someone I used to know, but that's impossible. My sister died to this family 20 years ago." Ilara didn't blink. She leaned forward into the light. "You told me the tape would hold because Armstrong promises never break. You told me that as long as we were in the library, nothing bad could ever find us." Sterling's hand began to tremble, the water in his glass rippling. I chose that moment to act. I leaned forward, slowly pivoting my heavy leather chair, until I was in full view, the amber light hitting my face for the first time. The color drained from Sterling's face with a speed that was almost sterile. He looked like a man watching a grave vomit its occupant. "My God. Little Annie." He whispered, his voice a hollow rasp. He looked at her, then his eyes snapped to mine, and the sheer terror in his gaze was the most honest thing I had seen from him in a decade. I didn't say a word. I simply sat there, dignified and silent, letting the reality of my survival and the return of the sister he'd discarded crash over him like a winter wave. Sterling's composure didn't just crack. It shattered like cheap glass under a librarian's heavy truth. Larissa, however, didn't move toward comfort or shock. She leaned in toward Sterling, her face a mask of panicked calculation. Her voice was a sharp, audible hiss that cut through the soft violin music playing in the distance. "Sterling, check if the records were actually sealed," she demanded, her eyes darting toward me with a venomous heat. She wasn't worried about the miracle of a father returned or a sister found. She was worried about the legal paper trail she had helped him bury 20 years ago. The taste of bitterness was heavy in the back of my throat. I watched them, the son who had left me to freeze, and the woman who had ensured my daughter remained a ghost, and I felt the weight of the letter in my pocket. Sterling's silk tie began to vibrate against his chest, moved by the frantic rhythm of his heart. He looked at the senior partner at the next table, then back at me, realizing the cage had no door. Sterling's wine glass shook so violently it rattled against the china. His eyes darting between me, the father he'd left for dead, and the sister he'd tried to delete from his history. I didn't give him time to breathe. I simply reached into my inner pocket and produced the first ghost of his past. I reached into my inner pocket and produced a ghost, a yellowed slip of paper that carried the weight of my life's work and my son's forgotten honor. I slid the $53,000 promissory note across the white tablecloth, letting it sit between the expensive appetizers like a poisoned gift. Sterling's hand froze, his fingers hovering inches from a silver fork. I watched the fluorescent light of the dining room catch the jagged edges of my signature on that paper, a signature I had penned with a heart full of pride in 2011. That was the year Beatrice and I drained our retirement savings, the bedrock of our old age, to fund Sterling's first independent law office. We didn't do it for the interest. We did it because we believed in the man we thought he was becoming. Sterling attempted to stutter an excuse, something about unprecedented business cycles and capital reallocation. But I held his gaze with a steady, clinical silence that effectively cut the air from his lungs. "I didn't ask for a return on investment, Sterling," I said, my voice as cold and dry as the air-conditioned room. "I asked for the return of my trust." He swallowed hard, his expensive silk tie vibrating with the visible tremors of his throat. "I was going to pay it back, Dad," he managed to rasp. Things just got complicated. The contrast between his luxury lifestyle, the designer watch glinting on his wrist, the late-model SUV parked outside, and this unpaid debt became the heavy, suffocating centerpiece of our table. I questioned him then about the liability he had mentioned on that freezing Christmas night. I made him look at the numbers, the $68,000, including interest, that he still owed his father, set against his refusal to let me sleep on a couch for a few nights. Larissa tried to intervene, her voice a sharp, cold blade of legal defense, suggesting that this was an inappropriate venue for financial disputes. However, Ilara cut her off with a single surgical look, reminding her that Sterling's current wealth was effectively built on my stolen retirement. I know you intercepted the insurance claim, Sterling. The $308,000, the $240,000 for the structure, and the $68,000 for displacement was meant to rebuild my life. You laundered it into your firm's operating capital while I froze in a parking lot thinking I'd never live to audit your greed. The psychological walls Sterling had built around his self-made success began to crumble brick by agonizing brick under the weight of my poverty. Before I reveal the truth behind that family medical matter we called about, tell me one thing. Do you think Sterling's betrayal was driven more by Larissa's influence or his own ego? Comment influence or ego and add one short reason why, so I can see how you're reading this. Please note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. What matters is the lesson behind it. If you're not comfortable with dramatized details, you're free to stop watching here. Ilara didn't wait for him to recover his composure. She reached into her bag and produced a tablet, the device clicking onto the table with a sound like a gavel. She began reading the dad situation email chain, aloud, her voice echoing in the wood-paneled room. Sterling's face turned from a pale white to a sickly, mottled gray as his own words were weaponized against him. She highlighted the specific passage where he referred to the historic blizzard as a perfect opportunity to break my stubbornness through desperation. The room felt smaller with every sentence she read. Desperation makes him agreeable, Sterling, I asked, leaning forward until I could smell the expensive cologne on his skin, now turning sour with the scent of cold sweat. Is that what they taught you in law school? To wait for a man to freeze before you negotiate his dignity. He looked at the tablet as if it were a mirror reflecting a monster he no longer recognized. I didn't mean it like that. He stammered, his head beginning to spin. It was just a way to get you the care you needed. The lie was so transparent it seemed to fog the air between us. As the final email was read, the one where he discussed the nursing home transition as a way to liquidate unnecessary assets, Sterling's last defense failed. He didn't see a father anymore. He saw a liability he had failed to bury. How does a man sleep in a $1,000 bed while his father's breath is freezing into ice in a parking lot? I didn't need him to answer. The answer was written in the way he collapsed. Sterling's head fell into his hands, his shoulders shaking with a sound that was half sob and half suffocation. In that moment of total moral collapse, he looked up at me, his eyes red and streaming. It was Larissa, he blurted out the words, a desperate attempt to shift the blame. The nursing home plan. It was her idea to free up money for the beach house in Naples. She said you wouldn't even know the difference. Larissa froze, her phone vibrating with a notification. She completely ignored, her eyes wide with the shock of being thrown to the wolves by the man she had coached. It was a joint venture in greed, a betrayal so complete it left me feeling hollowed out. Sterling continued to weep into his hands, the sounds of his breakdown drawing the eyes of the other diners, including his own senior partner at the nearby table. The silence that followed the last email was heavier than the frozen onslaught that had taken my home. I let that silence sit between us, like a heavy fog, watching the steam rise from my untouched tea while my son's life crumbled onto the white linen tablecloth. Sterling sat there, a broken shell of a man, his expensive suit looking suddenly like a costume that didn't fit. I stood up slowly, reclaiming every inch of my stature as the patriarch of this family. I was no longer the ghost in the truck. I was the librarian of his reckoning. It was New Year's Eve, the final night of 2024, and I was about to give Sterling Armstrong a resolution he would never forget. "I'm not interested in an apology, Sterling," I said, my voice carrying a cold, quiet authority that silenced the muffled clinking of silver from the main dining room. "I'm interested in restitution." I laid out the terms of my silence with surgical precision. The immediate repayment of the $68,000 was non-negotiable. The dissolution of the nursing home plan was to be finalized by morning. But more importantly, I demanded he make it right, including helping clear the lot himself in clearing the debris of the Monroe Street lot. Fear is a better teacher than love when the student is a shark, and I saw that fear reflected in his watering eyes. "You have 30 days to find your soul," I continued, "or Alara will send a mass email to every partner at your firm. I want you to know the feeling of being exposed, of having nowhere to hide." Larissa finally found her voice, though it was thin and brittle. "We can't just liquidate that much cash, Nick," she pleaded, her hands fluttering over her designer purse. "Think of the optics. Think of Marcus's prospects. If Sterling loses his position, the entire family suffers." I shut her down with a single look, a cold fire burning in my chest. "The optics of a frozen parking lot were much worse, Larissa," I reminded her. "You were willing to gamble my life for a beach house in Naples. Do not speak to me of Marcus's prospects when you were ready to make him the grandson of a man buried in a potter's field." She recoiled, as if I'd slapped her, her elite defenses finally crushed. Alara stood by my side, a silent, sterile enforcer of the truth, her presence ensuring that no legal loopholes would be found tonight. Can a check for $68,000 buy back the nights I spent talking to a ghost to keep from freezing? I knew the answer, but the price had to be paid regardless. I watched the ornate Whitney wallpaper seem to close in on Sterling as he realized the magnitude of his defeat. He was trapped in a room of his own, making surrounded by the high-status world he had sacrificed his honor to maintain. "Nick, I'll fix it," Sterling finally whispered, his voice a hollow rasp. "Whatever it takes. I'll clear the lot. I'll pay it all back." I looked at him, and for a fleeting moment I saw the little boy who used to help me shelve books, but the image was quickly replaced by the man who had let me starve for heat. "Don't call me Dad until you've earned the title back, with your hands, not your checkbook," I replied. I reached into my pocket and produced one last document. "I've already had Alara's legal contacts file a LIS pendens as part of a pending civil claim on the Dearborn property. You can't sell it, you can't leverage it, and you can't hide it. It is tied to my survival now." The twist of the knife was necessary. I needed him to understand that I was 3 steps ahead of his greed. I signaled to the waiter not for the check, but to indicate we were leaving. I left the folder and the mounting bill for the appetizers on the table. "Consider this a symbolic down payment on the debt you owe," I said. We walked out of the private room, the air in the foyer feeling lighter as we moved away from the stench of betrayal. Woodward Avenue was a ribbon of black glass, and for the first time in a year, I felt like the one driving the narrative. As we reached the heavy oak doors, I caught the eye of Sterling's senior partner at the bar. He nodded to me, a look of profound curiosity on his face. Sterling realized then that I didn't just threaten his reputation. I had ensured the proctor of his behavior was already in the room watching his every move. I stepped out into the Detroit night of December 31st. The cold air no longer biting, but invigorating. The stinging wind felt like a clean slate against my skin. I inhaled deeply, tasting the crispness of the winter air, knowing that the power had shifted irrevocably. My son would spend his next 30 days in the mud facing the ruins he had tried to ignore. Alara placed a set of keys in my hand keys to the SUV and the temporary home she had prepared. The weight of them felt real solid and earned. I turned back one last time to look at the stone sentinel of the Whitney, knowing that tomorrow morning, Sterling Armstrong wouldn't be looking at his stock portfolio or planning his next vacation. He'd be looking for a shovel. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a man with a foundation, and I was ready to rebuild. The story of Nick Armstrong wasn't ending in a parking lot. It was beginning again on the very ground they tried to steal from me. The white envelope sat on Ilara's granite countertop like a surrender flag, but I didn't reach for it until I had finished my coffee and seen the sweat on my son's brow through the window. See, the first check had arrived in a plain white envelope delivered by a courier whose impersonal nod matched the clinical efficiency Sterling was trying to maintain. I stood in Ilara's kitchen, watching the winter light bounce off the polished surfaces, feeling the physical weight of the security that piece of paper represented. I picked it up with steady fingers and pulled out the cashier's check for $68,000. It was the full repayment of the retirement loan, plus every cent of interest we had calculated. While the money meant I would never have to worry about a roof over my head again, I found I was less moved by the six-figure sum than by the plain, handwritten note Sterling had included in the fold. It didn't contain legal jargon or excuses. It simply said, "The first payment of a debt I can never truly settle." I realized then that while the financial ledger was balanced, the moral one was still deeply in the red. I looked out the window toward the SUV idling in the driveway, ready to take me to the ruins of my old life. "It was a start," Dad Ilara said, as she joined me, her eyes tracking the same path as mine. "But money is the easy part for him. He has to learn what it means to actually build something. $68,000 weighs less than a single shovel full of ash." I knew she was right. Forgiveness wasn't a transaction. It was a slow, grueling construction project. By the time we reached Monroe Street in Dearborn, the first March thaw had turned the lot into a landscape of gray mud and soot. Sterling arrived shortly after us, parked his luxury SUV at the curb, and stepped out looking like a man completely out of his element. He was dressed in expensive outdoor gear, the kind of rugged high-end clothing people wear for photo shoots, rather than labor, and his boots were so clean they seemed to glow against the grime. I didn't offer a hand or a hug. I didn't even offer a greeting. I simply walked to the back of Ilara's car, pulled out a heavy-duty steel shovel and a pair of thick work gloves, and handed them to him. "You wanted to value this vacant lot, Sterling," I said, my voice echoing in the hollow space where my living room used to be. "Now you can help clear it." "I'm here, Dad," he replied, his voice lacking the usual sharp edge of corporate authority. "Just tell me what to do." I pointed toward the charred, water-damaged remains of the main support beams. "We start there. You move the heavy debris to the curb. Every piece of it. Can a man's blisters actually heal the scars on his father's heart?" I wondered this as I sat on a salvaged wooden bench I had managed to pull from the rubble weeks ago, acting as the silent supervisor of his penance. For 6 grueling hours, I watched my son struggle with the physical remnants of my life. He moved slowly at first, his soft hands blistering despite the gloves, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he grappled with the weight of wet, ash-soaked timber. He was covered in soot. Within the first hour, the expensive designer fabric of his jacket stained by the very hoarding he had once mocked. I watched him handle the water-damaged fragments of the poetry section books he once claimed were just dust collectors, now seeing him treat them with a strange, hesitant care as he moved them to the salvage piles. I had hired a local charity to take the usable materials he was clearing, ensuring that his labor directly benefited the local homeless shelters. It was a poetic symmetry that wasn't lost on either of us. The ruins of my house were a graveyard, and for the first time, the man who helped dig the graves was trying to help with the resurrection. As the sun began to set over Dearborn, casting long orange shadows across the cleared earth, Sterling finally stopped. He leaned against the shovel, his face smeared with grit, his shoulders slumped with a physical exhaustion that no gym membership could have prepared him for. He looked at me, and for the first time in years, I didn't see the law partner or the social climber. I saw a man who was tired of being a villain. "This was the poetry section, Sterling," I said softly, gesturing to the cleared space. "Be careful with what's left of it." He looked down at the mud, his chest heaving. I didn't realize there was so much left to move," he admitted. He wasn't just talking about the wood. He was talking about the 20 years of silence he had piled on top of our relationship. As he turned to leave, I noticed he had discarded his high-end watch on the hood of his car earlier. He had forgotten to put it back on because it was slowing him down. It was a small detail, but it suggested the labor was finally reaching his ego, stripping away the accessories of the man he used to be. I watched the taillights of Sterling's SUV disappear into the evening gloom, leaving me alone with the cleared earth. For the first time in months, the silence of the lot didn't feel like a death or a failure. It felt like a clean slate. The ground was level, the debris was gone, and the foundation was ready for something new. I stood there in the cold March wind, no longer a victim of the storm, but the architect of a future I was finally ready to inhabit. The blueprints were waiting in Alara's study, blue and white promises of a house I never thought I'd see, but I knew the most important building had already begun in the dirt at my feet. The blueprints were blue and white promises of a house I never thought I'd see, spread across a sleek drafting table in a modern Detroit office that smelled of expensive pigment and limitless possibility. Ilara stood beside me, her finger tracing the lines of the first-floor library suite she had insisted upon. I watched the light catch the fine dust motes in the air, thinking of how different this was from the gray soot I had breathed just weeks ago. We met with a sustainable architect, a young woman with sharp eyes who spoke of geothermal loops and reinforced steel frames. I told her I wanted the shelves to catch the morning sun, because a library without light is just a warehouse. We planned a 2-story structure, a literal merging of my past and our shared future, incorporating salvaged bricks from the original foundation into the new fireplace. We were not just building a house, Ilara reminded me, we were building an anchor. Blueprints are the cartography of hope, mapping out a country where the winters no longer have teeth. I found myself obsessing over the structural details, needing to know that this time the roof would hold against the world. I spent hours in that office reconciling the man who had huddled by a water heater with the man who was now selecting premium cedar siding. In those moments of planning, the betrayal of the high-rise felt like a story from a different book, one I had finally moved to the back of the shelf. By May, the ground had fully softened, and the site was no longer a tomb, but a cradle. Sterling brought Marcus to a local park in Dearborn to meet me for the first time since my resurrection. I was struck by how much my grandson looked like Sterling did at 8, the same stubborn cowlick, the same wide, inquisitive eyes. But the boy was hesitant, standing with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes wide with a mix of wonder and the quiet confusion of a child meeting a legend. He had been told I was away on a long project, a half-truth that felt heavy in the air between us. I used my old librarian skills to bridge the gap, sitting on a low stone wall and telling him stories of the historic Detroit blizzards and the magic of hidden libraries. "Did the wind really take the whole roof?" Grandpa Marcus asked, his voice a tiny thread of curiosity. "It took the wood and the nails," Marcus, I told him, leaning in so only he could hear. "But it couldn't touch the stories. Those stay in the bones." I saw Sterling watching us from a distance, leaning against his car. He looked excluded, a man realizing that he had almost traded this generational continuity for a beach house in Florida. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his father almost let the world's best storyteller freeze to death? You don't. You just keep telling the stories until the ice melts. I discovered later that Sterling had been secretly visiting the lot on his lunch breaks, not to work, but to leave small offerings. bottles of cold water for the construction crew, and old family photos he had found in his own basement. It was a quiet, unforced desire to contribute that I hadn't expected. The construction crew prepared to pour the new foundation on Monroe Street in early June. I gathered the family Alara a soot-stained sterling and a curious Marcus around the wooden forms that outlined our future. Concrete is permanent. Forgiveness is not. I understood that as I looked at the wet, gray slurry waiting to be released. I produced a small waterproof copper box from my bag. Inside, I had placed Beatrice's reading glasses, a copy of her favorite Mary Oliver poem, and Alara's original A+ math sheet from 20 years ago. "This is the heart of the house," I told them, my voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming solemnity. "As long as these things are here, we are home." As the concrete mixer began its rhythmic thumping roar, I lowered the box into the wet cement. It was a spiritual sanctuary now anchored in the love of the old. I watched the gray slurry swallow the red-inked paper and the copper burying our secrets in the bedrock of my new life. The tactile coolness of the box was the last thing I felt before the house became a permanent reality. As the concrete settled, Ilara pulled me aside, a playful glint in her surgical eyes. She revealed that she had added a secret to the plans, a fireproof and stormproof book vault beneath the library suite, a room where I could house my most precious recovered volumes without ever fearing the sky again. I felt a sense of peace so profound it made my knees weak. The shadow resolved itself into the polished silhouette of Larissa Armstrong, her designer heels spining into the Michigan mud, with every hesitant step toward the man she once called a burden. I stood my ground, my hands calloused from months of helping the crew and my boots caked in the same earth Sterling had been turning over for weeks. She looked visibly uncomfortable, her gaze darting from the skeletal framing of the new house to the raw, unrefined environment of the construction site. She had come alone, stripped of the high-rise armor she usually wore so well. I watched her approach, noticing the way her expensive manicure seemed to mock the grit beneath her feet. She began a scripted apology, her voice carefully modulated as she spoke of her fear of instability and the unprecedented pressure of their lifestyle. I didn't interrupt. I simply let the silence of the lot weigh on her until she moved past her rehearsed lines. "I didn't think you'd actually survive it, Nick." She finally admitted, her voice dropping its professional sheen. "I thought it was easier if you were just a memory." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the cracks in the porcelain. "I've spent my life surrounded by books, Larissa." I said, my voice steady and gravelly. "I know the difference between a character arc and a performance." "Which one is this?" Larissa's apology was a beautifully bound book with nothing but blank pages inside. She struggled to reconcile her curated image with the reality of the earth her husband had been shoveling. In a rare moment of raw vulnerability, she confessed that her cruelty had been a shield for her own insecurities about their precarious, debt-fueled lifestyle. She even revealed that she had tried to call the police to report my truck abandoned in the Meyer lot on that second night. But she had been stopped by a sudden, paralyzing fear of Beatrice's ghost watching her from the shadows. Wealth is a loud noise. Honor is a quiet room. I realized then that she was more a prisoner of her own greed than I had ever been of the storm. I didn't forgive her, not yet, but I stopped seeing her as a monster and began seeing her as a tragedy. In August, the dynamic of our reckoning shifted from the private to the public. I received an invitation from Wayne State University to be honored for my 38 years of service and my contributions to the archival preservation of Detroit's history. They wanted to name a reading room after me. I initially hesitated, feeling the weight of my recent invisibility and the shame of the parking lot. "They want to name a reading room after a man who slept in a truck, Alara," I told my daughter as we sat on her porch. She squeezed my hand, her grip firm. "They want to name it after the man who taught an entire city how to remember Dad. You need to be there." I decided to invite Sterling, I didn't want him there as a guest of honor, but as a witness to the value of a life that cannot be measured in billable hours or luxury assets. How many years did I spend shelving the stories of great men while my own son treated me like a footnote? The gala at the university was a blur of floor wax, old parchment, and the stinging brightness of stage lights. When it was my turn to speak, I stood on the podium and looked out at a sea of former students, colleagues, and city leaders. I didn't speak of my loss or the cold. I spoke of the endurance of stories and the people who show up in the aftermath of a storm. He was sitting perfectly still, watching as hundreds of influential people he spent his career trying to impress rose to their feet in a thunderous, rhythmic ovation. The realization of what he almost destroyed, not just a man, but a legacy that commanded the respect of an entire city, finally broke his last remaining defenses. I could see the moisture in his eyes from across the room. After the ceremony, I was approached by Sterling's own boss, the senior partner from the firm. He remarked that he had no idea Sterling came from such distinguished stock, forcing Sterling to realize that my honor was now the only thing bolstering his own fading reputation. It was a power reversal more complete than any legal judgment. Sterling walked up to me as the crowd began to thin, his posture no longer that of the confident lawyer, but of a son who had finally found the bottom of his own soul. "I didn't know Dad." He whispered the words, sounding honest for the first time in 20 years. "I truly didn't know who you were." I felt the weight of the brass medal around my neck, a heavy and solid reminder of a life well lived. As the applause faded, Sterling looked at me with an expression that wasn't guilt or shame, but a terrifyingly honest kind of desperation. He reached out as if to steady himself, his hand trembling before he whispered the words that changed everything. "I'm leaving the firm, Nick. I can't be that man anymore." The sound of the first nail hitting the new steel roof was a rhythm I had been waiting a lifetime to hear. But the sound of my son finally choosing the truth was the real music of my resurrection. The skeleton of the new house rose against the autumn sky, like a promise kept, its pine ribs smelling of sap and survival instead of the rot and ash that had defined my last winter. I stood in the center of what would soon be my library, listening to the rhythmic thwack of hammers and the high-pitched whine of a circular saw. This was the music of a life being reassembled. As the applause from the university gala faded into a cherished memory, I found myself tethered to this ground in a way I hadn't been for decades. I watched my son Sterling step through the open studs of the front door. He wasn't wearing the tailored cashmere or the silk ties that had once been his second skin. Instead, he wore durable denim and work boots stained with the red Michigan clay. The transition in his physical appearance was startling, but the shift in his eyes was what truly mattered. He looked at me not as a liability to be managed, but as a man whose respect he was finally learning how to earn. I watched him pull a set of logistics papers from his pocket, his hands slightly calloused from months of helping the crew. He formally confirmed that he had resigned from his high-pressure law firm, a decision that had sent shockwaves through the local legal community. He revealed to me that the partners had offered him a senior partnership and a 7-figure buyout just to stay, a sum that would have secured his luxury lifestyle for a decade. He turned it all down. He did it so he could take a modest position at a nonprofit legal aid clinic, and more importantly, so he could ensure his Saturdays were free for woodworking sessions with me and his son Marcus. "The partners think I've lost my mind," Dad Sterling said, leaning against a pine stud that smelled of the forest. "Maybe I finally found it." I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the September sun. "It's a quieter life, Sterling," I replied. "But the air is easier to breathe when you aren't choking on secrets. Denim suits him better than deceit ever did." By the middle of the month, the crew began the raising of the shield. The new roof was installed, a reinforced steel structure designed to withstand the very storms that had once turned my world into a gray slush. I stood under the eaves during a light afternoon rain, hearing the rhythmic musical ping of water on metal. It was a sound of absolute security, a metallic heartbeat that signaled the end of my vulnerability. I felt a sense of safety I hadn't realized was missing until the first drop failed to reach my skin. Ilara joined me, her boots crunching on the sawdust-covered subfloor. We walked through the framed book vault, the storm-proof room she had designed specifically for my survivors, the rare first editions that had made it through the blizzard. We discussed where the cedar shelving would go and how the climate control would preserve the ink and paper for another century. "This roof isn't wrapping paper, Nick," she said, her voice full of a daughter's protective pride. "It's a shield." I nodded, looking at the sturdy beams above us. "I want Marcus to learn to read in this room," I told her. "I want him to know he's safe here. A house without a roof is a mouth waiting to be filled with the sky, but this mouth was finally closed, protected by steel and intent." By November, the basement workshop was the first room to be fully completed. I moved in my new tools, heavy cast-iron machines that were bolted to the concrete floor anchors that no wind could ever move. The air down here smelled of heavy, oily machine grease and the sweet, sharp scent of fresh sawdust. I spent hours alone in the quiet, organizing my chisels and hand planes, feeling the weight of the steel in my palms. For my first project, I selected a thick slab of cherry wood. It was from a tree that had fallen on my property during the blizzard, a piece of the destruction that I had salvaged and dried. I placed the wood on the lathe, the motor humming with a low, vibrant vibration that traveled through the floor and into my marrow. I picked up my favorite gouge, feeling the familiar balance of the tool. "Beauty from the broken," I whispered into the quiet of the shop. "That's the rule of the wood, Beatrice." This was for her a jewelry box that would hold the few fragments of her life we had pulled from the mud. Does the wood remember the storm that brought it down, or does it only care about the hand that shapes it now? I wondered this as I pressed the steel into the spinning cherry. The first curl of wood fell to the floor, a white shaving that spiraled like a frozen ribbon. It was the first physical act of creation in my new life, a transition from the man who had everything taken to the man who was shaping the wreckage into something meaningful. I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a peace that I had thought was lost forever in the parking lot. I watched the blade bite deeper, the scent of the cherry rising to meet me in a fragrant cloud. It was a smell of old forests and new beginnings. I was so engrossed in the work, so lost in the rhythm of the lathe, that I almost didn't hear the doorbell ring upstairs at Ilara's house. I paused the machine, slowing to a silent stop. It was a guest we hadn't invited, a sound that broke the sanctuary of my workshop. I wiped the sawdust from my hands, my heart giving a curious, steady thud. I watched the blade bite into the cherry wood, a ribbon of scent rising to meet me just as the doorbell of my daughter's house rang with the sound of a guest we hadn't invited. The hydraulic hiss of the moving truck's brakes felt like a long-awaited exhale, a sign that the ghosts of Monroe Street were finally being replaced by the weight of a living home. I watched the dust settle in the driveway as the back door of the trailer rolled up, revealing a cargo more precious to me than any gold. My library was coming home, but before the first box could be lowered, the uninvited guest I had heard at the door earlier made her presence known in the light of day. Ilara stepped forward to greet her, and I felt a jolt of recognition that bypassed my mind and went straight to the stinging memory of a cold Walmart aisle. It was the teenage cashier, the one who had looked at me with a flicker of humanity when the world had branded me a vagrant. Ilara had found her a quiet gesture of gratitude for the only soul who had seen me that day. I thanked her with a nod, a silent bridge between my lowest point and this new height. We didn't dwell on the past for long. There were thousands of stories waiting to be shelved. I supervised the unloading, watching as Sterling and Marcus carried the first boxes into my new study. Many of these volumes were new replacements for the rare editions that had bled their pigment into the Detroit slush. But the physical weight of them against my chest felt like my identity was being restored, one spine at a time. Sterling moved with a steady, quiet rhythm, his hands now accustomed to labor handling the books, with a reverence I had never seen from him before. He was no longer dismissive of the paper and glue. He was anchoring his own soul alongside mine. "Be careful with the spine on that one, Marcus," I said, guiding my grandson's small hands. "It's older than your father, and has survived more storms than I have." Marcus grinned, his boots thumping on the new hardwood floors with a sound of pure life. I didn't realize a house could feel this full before the people even moved in. Sterling remarked, looking at the floor-to-ceiling shelves. "A library is a heavy thing to move. So is a grudge." But as the shelves filled, the echoing rooms began to find their voice again. The silence of the frozen onslaught finally defeated by the rustle of turning pages. By the 10th of December, the interior was settled, and we turned our attention to the garden. Ilara and Larissa gathered in the backyard, the air crisp and smelling of coming snow. Larissa had brought a specific variety of rosebush, the heavy-petaled kind that Beatrice used to obsess over every spring. She handled the plant with a strange, hesitant care, her designer coat discarded for a pair of thick gardening gloves. We placed a memorial stone in the center of the winter garden, a permanent marker for the woman who should have been here to see the roof rise. The act was a final wordless apology from Larissa, a recognition of the woman she had tried to overlook. I accepted it by stepping beside her, showing her how to properly mulch the roots to protect them from the Michigan frost. She always said the winter was just the garden's way of dreaming. I whispered the words, hanging in the cold air like a prayer. Larissa looked at the stone and then at me. "I hope she can see this, Nick. I hope she knows we're trying." We stood together in the chill, but for the first time it was a shared, respectful silence. The winter garden was a white page waiting for the first ink of spring, and we were the ones finally holding the pen. Exactly 1 year after the sky fell, the Armstrong family gathered for Christmas dinner in the new dining room. The house was filled with the scent of old paper dust, roasting turkey, and the sharp, clean smell of the new pine framing. It was a sensory miracle. Marcus's laughter echoed through the hallway, a sharp, joyful contrast to the freezing truck cab where I had spent the previous Christmas Eve talking to a ghost. The table was a polished expanse of cherry wood, reflecting the candlelight like a dark mirror. Ilara led a grace that focused on second chances and the families we find when our own blood fails us. I looked around at the faces, the daughter who had rescued me, the son who had found himself in the mud, and the daughter-in-law who had learned the value of a foundation. "To the angels who show up in the snow and the sons who find their way home," I said, raising my glass. The taste of the expensive wine Sterling had brought was rich, but the satisfaction of the moment was deeper. 1 year ago, I was talking to a ghost in a parking lot. Tonight, I'm listening to my family. You never truly know what a roof is for until you've spent a year looking at the stars through your own ribs. I felt a peace so profound, it was almost frightening. But as the meal drew to a close, my eyes drifted to the center of the table. There sat the cherry wood jewelry box I had been working on for months, still wrapped in a soft velvet cloth. I felt the weight of the secret I had carved into the wood, the final lesson I had for the man who was now a partner in my resurrection. Sterling caught my gaze, his smile faltering as he reached into his pocket. "Before we finish, I have one more thing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He revealed that he had used the remainder of his beach house fund, the money that had nearly cost me my life, to establish the Beatrice Armstrong Literacy Foundation. He wanted her name to be associated with the love of books, rather than the greed he had nearly let consume him. I looked at the cherry wood jewelry box sitting at the center of the table, still wrapped in cloth, knowing that the secret I had carved into the wood was about to be the final word on who we were. The candlelight reflected in the cherry wood finish of the box, a deep, glowing red that looked like a heartbeat in the center of our table, pulsing with the weight of every secret I'd finally decided to share. The soft flicker of the flame danced across its polished surface, catching in the natural grain of the wood like veins beneath skin, alive, warm, enduring. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. I looked around the table at the faces illuminated by the warm holiday glow. Sterling, Larissa, Marcus, Ilara, the people who had once felt like fragments of a broken structure, misaligned, distant, cold, now sat within the same circle of light, drawn together not by obligation, but by something far harder earned. They were no longer just a family by name. They were a family that had survived something. Sterling sat slightly forward, his hands resting loosely together, no longer guarded, no longer defensive. Larissa's posture had softened the sharp edges of her composure, replaced by something quieter, more uncertain, but real. Marcus leaned closer to the table, eyes bright, unaware of the full weight of the moment, yet somehow sensing its importance. And Ilara. She sat still, her eyes already reflecting more than just candlelight. I reached for the velvet cloth, my fingers brushing over the smooth, polished surface of the wood beneath it. The texture was familiar, grounded, honest, shaped by time and intention. "This isn't just a gift, Ilara," I said, my voice steady, but carrying the quiet gravity of everything that had led us here. I paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "This wood came from the cherry tree that the blizzard brought down on our old roof." A subtle shift moved through the room. Memory, recognition, understanding. It was part of the destruction. I continued, my hand resting gently on the lid of the box, but now, it's a vessel for what we've built since. I slid the box toward her. Slowly, deliberately. Like placing something sacred into the hands of someone who had already proven they knew how to carry it. As Ilara opened the lid, the sweet, heavy scent of cherry wood and wax rose into the air, warm, grounding, familiar, in a way that reached beyond the present moment. It wasn't just a smell, it was a memory. Inside, I had carved a dedication, every letter shaped with care, every curve deliberate. Not just words, but recognition. Not just recognition, but truth. A truth that had taken years and a storm to finally be spoken out loud. "Your family chose you, Annie." I whispered the name, leaving my lips with a weight that made my chest tighten. It had been buried for years, locked away. But now, it felt right. And tonight, you chose us back. Her fingers trembled slightly as they traced the engraving lingering on each carved line, as if committing it to memory through touch alone. Ilara's eyes filled with tears, not sudden, not dramatic, but quiet, steady, undeniable. "It's beautiful, Dad." She breathed, her voice soft, almost reverent. "It smells like the library." That single sentence carried more meaning than anything else she could have said. Because she understood, not just the object, but everything behind it. Sterling and Larissa watched in silence. Not the kind that comes from discomfort, but the kind that comes from realization, from seeing something clearly for the first time. They finally understood that inheritance had never been about property. It had never been about ownership. It had never been about numbers. It had always been about legacy. And legacy is not what you receive, it's what you carry forward. A family is just a collection of stories bound by the same spine of history. I felt the weight of that truth settle into me as I looked at my son, not the man he had been at his worst, but the man he was slowly becoming. For the first time in years, I no longer saw him trying to rewrite the story by erasing parts of it. He had stopped tearing pages out. He was finally learning how to read what was already there. I took a slow breath. "There's one more thing," I said. The room shifted again, subtle but immediate. "I've already updated my will." No one interrupted. No one questioned. The silence remained intact, but attentive. The new house, the book vault, the literacy foundation. I paused briefly, letting the structure of it settle. They will all be left in Alara's name, as primary executor. I looked directly at her. I'm making the chosen daughter the sole beneficiary and independent executor of the Armstrong estate. A legal decision. Yes, but more than that. A declaration. A final acknowledgement that blood alone does not define belonging. That choice does. That presence does. That loyalty, real loyalty, is proven in action, not assumed by title. Sterling didn't flinch. That was the moment I knew everything had truly changed. He didn't argue. He didn't react. He didn't even look surprised. He simply nodded. Not as a man who had lost something, but as a man who had finally understood his place within something larger than himself. He had stopped trying to be the center and found peace in being part of the whole. On Christmas morning, the house was filled with the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the new hallways. It wasn't just noise. It was life. The kind of life that fills space in a way furniture never can. Marcus ran through the rooms with the effortless energy of someone who had never known what it meant to lose a home, but would grow up understanding what it meant to build one. I took him down to the basement workshop, the air thick with the scent of pine needles machine oil and the distant aroma of a holiday meal being prepared upstairs. He moved slowly at first, his curiosity cautious but eager. I let him touch the cast iron tools, guiding his small hands over their weight, their edges, their purpose. These aren't just tools, I told him. They're extensions of what you choose to create. I showed him the lathe, the chisels, the grain of the wood waiting to be shaped. He looked at everything with wide eyes, not overwhelmed but fascinated, like he understood that this place mattered. "Grandpa," he asked, resting his small hand on the workbench, "can we build something that the wind can't break?" I smiled. Not because the question was simple, but because the answer was not. "We already did, Marcus," I said, placing my hand gently over his. "We're standing inside it. Because strength isn't always in the material. Sometimes it's in what holds it together." I made a promise then, not loudly, not ceremonially, but clearly. To teach him, to pass on what I knew, to show him how to build not just things, but meaning. Because the Armstrong legacy was no longer about control or wealth or inheritance. It was about craftsmanship, integrity, continuity. The lathe was silent, but the legacy was louder than it had ever been. Later that afternoon, as the light began to fade, I returned to my study. The room was warm, still, filled with the quiet presence of books that had survived and new ones waiting to be read. I sat in my high-backed chair, the familiar weight of a tea mug in my hands, grounding me in the moment. Outside, the sky shifted into deep purples and golds, settling over snow-covered Dearborn like a closing chapter written in light. I looked forward, not at anyone in the room, but beyond it, at the unseen, at the people who had followed this journey, who had listened, who had stayed. "If you're listening to this in your own storm," I said quietly, "just remember, no winter lasts forever." I paused, because that truth deserved space, and sometimes the wind has to take the roof, so you can finally see the stars. I spoke of the angels who appear when you least expect them, of the people who choose you when others walk away, of the truth that family is not defined by blood, but by presence, by action, by choice. "Don't wait for a blizzard," I added softly, "to tell the people you love that they belong at your table, because by then, it might already be too late." I stepped out onto the front porch, the cold air brushing against my face, not biting, not harsh, but clean, alive. The neighborhood lights flickered on one by one, each window a story, each home a world. I picked up my favorite book of poetry from the side table and felt something shift between the pages, A small hand-carved wooden bookmark. Not mine, not placed there by me. I turned it over. SG, and beneath it, in careful, unsteady lettering, "Thank you for not giving up." I held it for a long moment, not as an object, but as proof. Proof that something had reached him, that something had stayed, that something had changed. I closed the book gently. "This is Nick Armstrong," I said quietly, looking out into the fading light. "From Dearborn, Michigan." I let the words settle. The roof is solid, a breath, and the heart is full. I turned back toward the warmth of the living room, toward the voices, toward the life inside. And for the first time in 68 years, I didn't just have a house. I had a home. Looking back, I realized my greatest mistake wasn't trusting my son. It was believing that blood alone could protect me. I stayed too long in silence, convincing myself that loyalty was automatic, that love didn't need to be questioned. But silence has a cost. It slowly erases your boundaries, your dignity, and eventually your place in someone else's life. Don't be like me. When respect begins to fade, don't explain it away, face it. When love starts to feel conditional, don't ignore it, question it. This family story taught me that loyalty must be mutual, not assumed. And sometimes what looks like a dad revenge story is really a man learning to reclaim his dignity piece by piece. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this: never allow anyone, even your own child, to reduce your worth to convenience. I once believed that being a father meant enduring everything quietly. I was wrong. A true family story isn't built on shared names or bloodlines. It's built on consistent actions, on showing up when it matters most. My journey may sound like dad revenge, but it wasn't about punishment. It was about survival. It was about standing back up in a world that had already decided I was no longer needed. I also learned that grace matters more than anger. I didn't win because my son lost. I won because I refused to stay broken. There is a difference between holding on to pain and transforming it into something meaningful. Bitterness keeps you frozen in the past, but growth forces you to move forward even when it hurts. And through all of it, I believe God placed the right person in my path at the exact moment I needed saving, not just from the cold, but from losing myself completely. That reminder changed everything. I was never truly abandoned, only redirected. So if you're facing your own storm right now, whether it's betrayal, loss, or silence that cuts deeper than words, remember this. This family story is proof that endings can become beginnings. The moment you think everything is over might be the moment your real life begins again. And what some may call dad revenge can actually be redemption. In disguise, a second chance to rebuild not just your life, but your identity. I rebuilt my home, yes, but more importantly, I rebuilt my sense of self. I learned that being needed is not the same as being valued, and being loved should never come at the cost of your dignity. The storm didn't just take my roof, it stripped away every illusion I had about what family meant. And in doing so, it gave me the clarity I had been avoiding for years. Thank you for walking this journey with me all the way to the end. I'd truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were in my situation, left alone in the cold by someone you trusted most? Would you walk away? Or would you fight to rebuild your perspective? Matters more than you think. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey we take together. And just a gentle note, while inspired by emotional conflicts, many people can relate to this, is a fictional story with dramatized elements created to deliver meaningful and valuable insights. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that better match your interests.